The diamonds sat in front of me, each one glittering like a tiny shard of frozen fire. 8 stones, polished to perfection, worth over 15 million euros combined. For the past 10 years, I'd been Antwerp's most trusted courier, moving fortune after fortune between vaults, dealers, and buyers across Europe. My hands were steady, my reputation unblemished. No questions asked, no jobs turned down. A courier is supposed to be invisible, just a shadow in the endless chain of wealth. But I wasn't invisible anymore. 2 weeks ago, I'd sat in a bar off Pelikanstraat, nursing a whiskey that burned too hard, when Victor Conrad slid into the stool beside me. Victor, bald, scarred, and always dressed like he was auditioning for a Bond villain, was a name that sent whispers through Antwerp's underworld. He leaned close, his breath reeking of cigars and menace. "You're wasted on them, Danny," he growled. 10 years of loyalty, and you still live in a studio apartment?" I shrugged him off, but his words clung to me like tar. He wasn't wrong. Every time I moved another shipment worth millions, I thought about the numbers. What the buyer paid, what the broker took, what I earned for being the mule. A tidy commission, always clean, but never enough to scrape above the surface of real wealth. And now here I sat, staring at this shipment like a man at a crossroads. My employer, René Dubois, trusted me like family. Hell, I was family to him. He'd taken me in when I was young, fresh off the train from London after my parents split. René gave me this life, this trade. So why did I feel like every breath I took in Antwerp was stolen? The clock on the wall ticked too loud as I locked the case shut. My next delivery was to Zurich, a shipment of flawless diamonds for a buyer whose face I'd never see. Just another run, except it wouldn't be. I'd spent the past month preparing for this moment. Victor had been right about one thing. I was done playing by their rules. I had a plan to vanish, me and the diamonds both. A plane ticket was waiting under a false name, cash wired to untraceable accounts. I could trade Antwerp's claustrophobic alleys for the open air of Argentina, or maybe Bangkok. I'd live quietly but comfortably. No one would ever find me, but first I had to slip away with 15 million euros in my pocket. The next morning I sat in René's office for a final check-in before Zurich. The air smelled of leather and pipe smoke as sunlight cut through the blinds. René stood behind his desk, inspecting me like he always did, his pale blue eyes narrowing slightly behind wire-rimmed glasses. "You look tired, Danny." I gave him my best smile. "Long week." He nodded, seeming satisfied, before passing me the case. It was small, lined with black velvet inside, the diamonds sealed in tamper-proof pouches. Even with all their brilliance, it still didn't look like something that could change a man's life. "Zurich is simple," René said, his voice clipped. "Train leaves at noon. You'll meet our buyer's man at Hotel Adler by 6. He'll know the code." "Understood." René hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Danny, do you ever think about what you'll do after this work? Life beyond Antwerp?" My heart stuttered, but I kept my face blank. "Not really." "You should," he said softly. "Loyalty gets rewarded, but there's more to life than moving stones." I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. I took the case and left his office, the weight of his words pressing heavier than the diamonds. René thought he knew me, but he didn't. He didn't know what I was about to do. I boarded the noon train to Zurich with everything mapped out. I'd rehearsed every step, visualized every detail, how I'd slip through the cracks, double back, and disappear. The diamonds sat beside me, locked tight in the case like a holy relic. No one looked twice at me, a courier in a cheap suit, sipping bad coffee as the Belgian countryside whipped by. But halfway through the ride, things started to unravel. 2 men in dark suits boarded at the Liège stop. They didn't sit, didn't talk, just stood by the exits, scanning the train. My gut clenched. These weren't law enforcement. They were private security, hired muscle. And I knew immediately who'd sent them. René. Had he suspected me? Had my plan been too obvious? I slid lower in my seat, shielding the case with my leg as I tried to think. Zurich was no longer an option. I'd be dead before the train pulled into the station. I needed to disappear now. The train slowed for a rural stop in Namur, and I made my move. As soon as the doors hissed open, I was out, pulling my coat tight against the cold wind as the guards scrambled to see where I'd gone. The platform was deserted. I bolted down the stairs and out into the narrow streets of the village beyond. Every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, but I needed a new plan. Zurich was blown, so I needed an exit off the grid. I checked my watch. If I could reach the border by nightfall, I could still catch a flight. Geneva had options, and Victor had given me contacts there. But first, I had to lose my tail. I ducked into a grimy cafe, sweat slick on my neck despite the cold. Through the window, I saw the two men circling, scanning faces in the crowd. They were good, too good for comfort. I needed a distraction. I dropped a €50 note at the counter and slipped through the back door into an alley that smelled of damp bricks and old oil. From there, I ran across streets, through empty lots, cutting between buildings like a rat in a maze. The men chased, but I'd been planning this for months. I knew exactly how to disappear in plain sight. By dusk, I was holed up in a dingy motel 20 kilometers south, my pulse finally slowing. The case sat on the bed like Pandora's box. I unlocked it with shaky hands, staring at the diamonds as they caught the dying light. 15 million euros. Enough to buy my freedom 10 times over. But René wouldn't stop looking for me. I'd broken the code, his trust, his system, and in the diamond trade, betrayal was never forgiven. If I wanted out, I needed to run harder, faster than I ever had before. The room was a box. 4 walls, a single window with cracked glass, and a bed that smelled like mildew and regret. I sat on the edge of the mattress, the diamond case on my lap, staring at it like it might speak to me. Outside, the night was quiet, the occasional hum of a passing car reminding me that the world was still turning, oblivious to the chaos I'd just kicked off. I'd crossed a line. There was no going back. My burner phone buzzed in my pocket. I fumbled it open, my fingers trembling. It was a message from Victor. "You're late. Geneva's waiting. Move fast." Geneva. It was my best shot. From there I could vanish into the wind. Argentina, Thailand, Morocco, anywhere with no extradition treaty and loose laws about men with new names and heavy wallets. Victor had arranged it all, a clean exit for a dirty crime. But as I sat there watching the screen dim, the enormity of what I'd done hit me like a sledgehammer. René wasn't just my employer. He was a kingpin in Antwerp's diamond trade. He had resources, eyes in every port, and friends in every border checkpoint. If he suspected me, he'd already put his bloodhounds on my trail. And those men on the train? They were just the beginning. I shoved the phone back into my coat and stood, pacing the narrow room. I needed to move, but not blindly. The road south to Geneva would be watched. René would expect me to head for Switzerland. I had to get creative. Think of every step as a chess move. Predictable, and I'd be dead before dawn. At 4 a.m., I slipped out of the motel under a sky smeared with stars. The diamonds were locked in my backpack, wrapped so tightly it felt like part of me. I made for the bus station on foot, my breath fogging the icy air. Small towns like Namur were easy to leave. No CCTV cameras, no crowds to remember your face. I bought a ticket for Paris with cash. The bus smelled of stale coffee and diesel as it pulled away, bouncing over worn roads. I found a seat at the back, tucking myself into the corner like I belonged there. With every kilometer we covered, my shoulders eased, just a little. But paranoia is a cruel mistress. At a stop near the French border, a man climbed aboard, tall, sharp-jawed, with a leather jacket that screamed mercenary. He glanced around the bus, his eyes lingering on the faces too long, one by one, like he was searching. My throat tightened. I didn't know if René had tracked me this far, but I wasn't waiting to find out. I slipped my phone from my pocket, typing out a message to Victor. "Change of plan. Paris compromised. Need new route." Seconds later, the response came. "Head to Lyon. I'll arrange the rest." Lyon, I could work with that. By the time the bus pulled into Paris, the sun was rising and a splash of muted gold over the horizon. I slipped off through the back exit of the station, cutting across alleys and back streets until I reached the metro. I bought another ticket, Lyon-bound, and disappeared into the throng of morning commuters. Inside the train, the case never left my grip. Around me, Parisians read newspapers, scrolled their phones, sipped their coffees. For them, it was just another day. For me, every screech of the track sounded like a death knell. Every cough, every shifting body felt like it could mask the moment someone moved to take me out. I closed my eyes and let the hum of the train swallow me, running through Victor's instructions again in my mind. Lion was just a stopover. A man, someone Victor trusted, would meet me at an old warehouse near the station. From there, I'd get my documents, the new passport, the tickets. Argentina was still the plan, but the route had changed. As we approached Lion, I noticed him, another face in the crowd. This one was younger, maybe mid-30s, in a charcoal suit that didn't quite fit. He sat 2 rows ahead but kept glancing back, subtly, like he didn't want to be caught looking. I knew the type, an amateur trying to play professional. Renee was closing in. The train lurched into Lion, brakes squealing against metal. I waited until the last second to move, letting the crowd shove me toward the doors. The man in the suit followed, pushing through passengers, his head swiveling. My heart pounded in my throat, but I didn't run. Not yet. Instead, I slipped left as soon as my feet hit the platform, cutting through the waiting crowd and heading for an emergency exit near the far end of the station. The man didn't see me. He was still moving straight, scanning the flow of passengers. Once I was clear, I broke into a sprint, ducking downstairs, then up through a maze of underpasses that dumped me into a quiet street behind the station. I stopped to catch my breath, pressing myself against a cold brick wall. Lion was waking up around me. Shop owners rolled up metal shutters and cars began to clog the roads. I melted into the morning fog, keeping my head low as I made my way to the meeting point. The warehouse was easy to find, abandoned, looming against the sky like a forgotten relic. I slipped inside through a rusted door, my footsteps echoing across the concrete floor. It smelled of oil and dust. "Danny?" The voice startled me. I spun, reaching for the knife I kept in my coat, but it was only Victor's man, a wiry figure in jeans and a bomber jacket. He held up his hands. "Easy, I'm Pierre. Victor sent me." I exhaled slowly, lowering my guard. "You have the documents?" "Everything." He handed me a brown envelope. Inside, I found the passport, my photo, a new name, Elias Varga. There was a one-way ticket to Buenos Aires and a thick bundle of euros. "The diamonds?" Pierre asked. I hesitated. My hand tightened on the backpack strap. Trust no one. Wasn't that the rule? But I didn't have a choice. I needed Victor's network to get me out of Europe alive. "Here," I said, unzipping the bag just enough to flash the stones. Pierre whistled low, his eyes widening. "You've got balls, Danny. You've got no idea." He handed me a phone. "This is clean. Victor will call you once you're in Buenos Aires." I nodded, shoving the items into my coat. I turned to leave, my heart hammering against my ribs. But then Pierre said something that froze me in my tracks. "Oh, and one more thing. René's not happy. He's offering $5 million for your head." $5 million. Enough to turn half the continent into bounty hunters. I stepped outside, the chill of the morning air hitting me like ice water. My escape wasn't going to be clean, but I was in too deep to stop now. Argentina was waiting. I just had to survive long enough to reach it. I left the warehouse with Pierre's words lingering in my ears like a death sentence. $5 million for your head. That wasn't a bounty, it was a declaration of war. René wouldn't stop until someone brought him my body, preferably cold and with the diamonds in hand. I glanced down at the clean phone Pierre had handed me, my gut twisting with mistrust. Victor was the only ally I had left, but I knew better than to trust blindly. For all I knew, he could have been the one feeding René my moves. I tucked the phone into my coat and slipped into Lyon's waking streets. Mist still clung to the ground, and the early risers paid me no mind as I moved. I needed to disappear until my train to Marseille departed later that evening. From there, I'd make the flight to Buenos Aires Victor had arranged. "Think like a ghost, Danny," I muttered to myself. I changed into a thrift store jacket and hat I'd picked up on the way to the station. My old coat and any trace of my prior appearance were dumped in a public trash bin. I kept the diamonds close, wrapped tightly in the small backpack that now clung to my shoulders like a parasite. It was my lifeline, and my burden. At midday, I ducked into a cafe near Place Bellecour, blending in with the office workers and tourists sipping espressos. I chose a corner seat with a view of the entrance, my back to the wall. From there, I could see anyone who might be trailing me. Lion was bustling now, too alive for a clean hit, but it wouldn't stay that way. Professional hunters had patience. I stirred my coffee absently, pretending to scroll through my phone while I scanned every face that entered the cafe. It didn't take long to spot trouble. Across the square, leaning against a stone railing, was the man from the train station, the one in the ill-fitting charcoal suit. He hadn't followed me here by accident. My blood turned to ice. The question now wasn't whether he was after me, but who sent him? René? Or worse, was this Victor testing my loyalty? I stayed calm. Paranoia was my companion now, and it wouldn't do to lose my edge. I left a crumpled note under my coffee cup, a habit I'd picked up for drop-offs in the past. It simply read, "Eyes on me. 2 minutes." If anyone was monitoring this cafe, they'd know I'd seen the tale. I needed to shake him, fast. I slipped out through a side exit into a narrow alley, hugging the shadows. The noise of the square faded as I moved deeper, the world closing in on me like a steel trap. My boots splashed in dirty puddles as I cut through Lyon's maze of streets. The air stank of diesel and rot. I turned left, then right, weaving through shortcuts only locals would know. But when I glanced back over my shoulder, I froze. The man was still there. He wasn't chasing me. No, that would have been too obvious. Instead, he was shadowing me. Patient, deliberate, a true predator in a sea of sheep. I ducked into a deserted market courtyard, my heart hammering. My brain was working overtime now, running scenarios, calculating risks. This was the moment when most amateurs panicked, ran for the nearest exit, and ended up dead. But I wasn't an amateur. "Okay," I whispered. "Time to play the long game." I slipped into an empty butcher's shop, its shutters drawn. The back door creaked open as I eased inside. Through a cracked window, I watched the man in the suit linger outside the courtyard, clearly waiting for me to show my face again. I didn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, I waited. 5 minutes. 10. He finally moved, pulling a phone from his pocket and speaking into it, before walking off toward the main streets. The moment he was out of sight, I exhaled. By early evening, I was back at the Lyon train station, lingering near the platforms. The crowds had thickened, people rushing to catch trains out of the city, their luggage bumping along behind them. I'd chosen a route to Marseille because it wasn't glamorous. There was no first-class cabin, no sleek private train, just me, the backpack, and a sea of strangers. I scanned the station, looking for my charcoal-suited tail. Nothing. Had I shaken him, or had I just lulled myself into a false sense of security? I didn't know, and it didn't matter now. When the train to Marseille pulled in, I boarded quickly, choosing a seat in the middle car, halfway down the aisle. I slumped low, the backpack tucked tightly between my feet, my eyes fixed on the window. The platform outside grew smaller as the train lurched forward. As we left Lyon behind, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The quiet didn't last. An hour into the trip, I noticed him again. Not the man in the suit. This one was younger, scruffier, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He'd boarded at one of the small stations along the route. And though he made a show of checking his phone, I knew he was watching me. It was subtle, too subtle for an amateur. I ran a hand through my hair, pretending not to notice. My mind was already running ahead, planning. If he was with René, that meant they'd found me faster than I thought possible. If he was with Victor, it meant I was being tested. Either way, I was done playing nice. The train slowed as it approached a stop. Without hesitation, I stood, shouldering the backpack and slipping down the aisle toward the door. The man with the cap noticed immediately, his head jerking up. I didn't wait. The moment the train stopped, I jumped onto the platform, weaving through disembarking passengers, like my life depended on it, because it did. I heard a voice behind me shout, but I didn't turn around. I sprinted for the opposite platform, catching sight of a regional train idling on its tracks. A whistle blew as I leapt onto the steps just as the doors began to close. I turned just in time to see the man in the cap burst onto the platform, his face twisted with frustration. Too late. I collapsed into a seat, gasping for breath, as the train pulled away. This was getting out of control. I was one man, running on adrenaline and instinct. Renee's men were closing in, and my chances of making it to Buenos Aires were getting slimmer by the minute. Victor was my only hope. But as I stared out at the passing countryside, I couldn't help but wonder, had Victor set me up too? I moved quickly through the streets of Antwerp, keeping my head down and my bag close. The more I thought about it, the more the weight of my decision sank in. There was no turning back. With every step, I knew I was a courier no longer. I was a thief, a smart one, I hoped. The smoking gun, as I like to call it, sat snugly inside my bag. 8 million euros worth of small, clear perfection. A courier carrying a single diamond would often travel with an air of casual invisibility. A courier carrying diamonds worth entire city blocks? Now that kind of cargo would make anyone's neck itch. I couldn't let it show. I forced my face into indifference. Just another man walking home from work. The plan was relatively simple in execution, but would require razor-sharp precision. I'd long been studying Antwerp's Courier Square district, a small grid of cafes, boutiques, and unassuming alleyways. It was a maze where any tale, be it law enforcement, private security, or worse, a thief for hire, could easily lose me if I played it smart. My meeting spot with Camille was Café Bertrand, an obscure little joint that served decent espresso and lousy pastries. More importantly, the cafe owner, an old man named Henri, had a soft spot for me. I'd dropped hints over the years, small tokens of kindness, that I might one day need his help. I had no doubt he'd look the other way. When I reached Bertrand's, Camille was already seated at a corner table, her back to the window. She wore an oversized scarf that nearly swallowed her face, leaving only her sharp brown eyes visible. Her nerves were written all over her movements. She tapped her nails rhythmically on her ceramic cup. I slid into the chair across from her and leaned forward. "You have it?" she whispered. I glanced around the cafe. 2 elderly patrons sat near the counter. A couple mumbled to each other on the far end, and Henri grunted over his espresso machine. No one was watching us. "It's here," I said quietly, patting the bag resting at my feet. "What's the next move?" Camille exhaled, leaning closer. "The fence is waiting in Rotterdam. Name's Kofi. He's careful, but once he sees the diamonds, he'll move fast. We're splitting at the border. I take my cut, and you disappear." "Disappear where?" Her eyes narrowed. "Wherever you want. That's the point of all this." I nodded, forcing myself to breathe. "And what about Antwerp? You really think we can get out without them sniffing us down?" Camille smirked faintly. "They'll look in every direction except ours if we don't panic." Easier said than done. My employers, wealthy diamond magnates with decades of ruthless connections, weren't people who simply wrote off losses. Once they realized I'd gone rogue, they'd tear Antwerp apart looking for me. And that wasn't all. Camille hadn't mentioned it, but I could feel it in the pit of my gut. Law enforcement was already close to finding cracks in the facade. Camille reached for her bag and tossed me a burner phone. "You need to ditch your number now. That SIM card in there? Fresh and untraceable. Kofi will call you at sunrise with the Rotterdam coordinates. Don't screw this up." "You're awfully confident in me," I said, though the sarcasm fell flat. Camille didn't smile. "This only works if we're perfect. Slip once, and we're dead." Her words settled like stones in my chest. Camille wasn't prone to exaggeration, and I knew she wasn't being dramatic. I finished the dregs of my espresso, set the cup down, and nodded. "Tomorrow morning, then." As I stood up, Henri waved from behind the counter, smiling faintly as if nothing unusual had just happened. Camille stayed seated, staring blankly at the wall. We'd practiced this. No lingering gazes, no unnecessary conversation. I exited through the cafe's back door into a narrow alleyway, where the cold hit me like a punch to the ribs. The streets were quieter now, the city falling into its twilight lull. I tightened my grip on the bag as I melted into the crowd, headed toward my apartment. I passed under dim streetlights, thinking about Camille's words. One slip and we're dead. At my apartment door, I hesitated. Years of routine had trained me to stay invisible. A quiet life, small luxuries, no traceable questions. But this moment, holding stolen fortune in my hands, was the antithesis of every safe decision I'd ever made. I pushed the door open, flicked the lights on, and froze. My apartment had been searched. Drawers half open, the couch cushions slashed, papers scattered like confetti across the floor. My heart thundered in my chest. The bag slipped from my shoulder, dangling loosely in my grip. Someone had been here, recently, and they'd been looking for something specific. I pulled the burner phone out of my pocket, dialing Camille's number, but it rang endlessly. Dead silence on the other end. My stomach dropped. Either she wasn't answering, or someone else had reached her first. I stood frozen in the doorway of my ransacked apartment, adrenaline lighting up every nerve like fireworks. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry. The air still carried the faint scent of cigarette smoke. My instinct screamed that I had minutes, if that, before someone came back. Whether it was my employers, law enforcement, or someone I didn't yet know, the fact was clear. My head was now in their crosshairs. I swept through the apartment, scanning the damage. Drawers hung open, my closet had been emptied onto the floor, and the lining of my mattress was slashed open like a gutted fish. They were thorough, and my stomach clenched at the obvious question, were they still watching me? I grabbed the essentials, cash stashed under a floorboard, the burner phone Camille had given me, and the black duffel bag with the diamonds still safely inside. My hands shook as I zipped it shut. I'd seen paranoia eat away at men before, but now the walls felt like they were closing in on me. A nagging question gnawed at the edges of my mind. How had someone gotten here so fast? Camille hadn't even sent me coordinates for Rotterdam yet. I slipped into the alleyway behind my building, breathing in the cold night air. If someone was watching, they weren't making it obvious, yet. The city felt darker, sharper now, like every shadow was ready to swallow me whole. I couldn't go to Camille. She was either compromised or had hung me out to dry. But I wasn't stupid enough to give up the only leverage I had, the diamonds. Rotterdam was still the plan, at least for now. Kofi, the fence Camille had mentioned, might be my only way out of this, assuming he hadn't already cut a deal with someone else. That was the thing about fences. They worked for money, not loyalty. My gut told me this job had spiraled far beyond its original players. I headed for the train station on foot. Taxis could be traced, and I couldn't risk anything that might tie me to a location. My mind was racing, replaying every conversation Camille and I had had over the past few months. Something wasn't adding up. She'd been too calm, too confident, like she knew something I didn't. I ducked into a convenience store near the station and bought a cheap hoodie and cap to change my appearance. It wasn't much, but I didn't need to look invisible. I just needed to look forgettable. As I slipped into the hoodie in the dingy restroom, my burner phone buzzed. Unknown number. I hesitated before answering, keeping my voice steady. Yeah? The line crackled. Rotterdam, Dock 12, tomorrow at dawn. The voice was clipped, accented, and unfamiliar. Before I could respond, the call ended. No names, no details, just coordinates and a deadline. It had to be Kofi, but the timing felt too convenient. I slid the phone back into my pocket and glanced at the bag. The diamonds were a fortune, a magnet for every kind of trouble. I'd thought I was clever, stealing from the Diamond Kings, but the deeper I got, the more it felt like I'd walked into a trap I couldn't see. The train ride to Rotterdam was hell. I sat near the back of the car, surrounded by quiet commuters and the hum of the engine. But every screech of the brakes made me flinch. Was the man in the navy coat watching me? Was the woman scrolling her phone really just texting? I felt their eyes everywhere, even when I knew they weren't looking. By the time I arrived at the docks the next morning, the sun was a thin sliver of gold along the horizon, and the air smelled of salt and rust. Dock 12 loomed ahead, gray, empty, and silent. I slipped between two shipping containers, scanning the area. Kofi was supposed to meet me here. Instead, I found Camille. She was perched on a stack of pallets, smoking a cigarette, her expression unreadable. A chill ran through me as I approached, my hand resting near the strap of the bag. "You're early," she said. "So are you," I replied, narrowing my eyes. "Where's Kofi?" Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Change of plans." I didn't like the way she said it, or the calmness in her voice. Camille was always sharp-edged, her energy crackling like a live wire. Now she was too composed. It hit me then. I'd been played. "You led them to me," I said, my voice low. She shrugged, flicking ash from her cigarette. "You didn't make it easy. I'll give you that." The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, heavy and deliberate. I turned just in time to see two men emerge from the shadows, their movements precise. They were pros, private security, most likely hired by my former employers. My pulse hammered in my chest. "You should have stayed a courier, Lucas," Camille said, standing. "There's no winning at this level." "Then why are you here?" I shot back. Camille stepped closer, her eyes locking onto mine. "To collect my share." My mind raced. I couldn't fight two armed men, not here. But Camille had made a mistake. She was too close, too confident, and in that moment I realized what I had to do. I grabbed the bag, hoisting it between us like a shield. One of the men lunged, shouting something in French, but I was already running, straight toward the water. My legs burned, every step fueled by raw panic and the certainty that if they caught me, I was dead. I hit the edge of the dock and didn't stop. With a final breath, I launched myself into the freezing water, the bag strapped to my back. The shock of it tore the air from my lungs. Above me, I heard shouting, Camille's voice, angry and shrill. Gunshots rang out, muffled underwater as I sank deeper. My muscles screamed, but I forced myself to kick, swimming toward the nearest pier piling. When I finally surfaced, I was hidden in the shadow of the dock. The men were still scanning the water, their flashlights slicing through the misty dawn. Camille stood on the edge, her figure silhouetted against the rising sun. She thought she'd won, but I wasn't done yet. The water around me felt like ice-cold needles piercing my skin. My lungs burned as I clung to the barnacle-covered piling beneath the dock, desperately trying to quiet my breaths. Above, the men continued to scan the water with their flashlights, beams slicing the gloom like razor blades. I stayed hidden, counting the seconds. The voices grew fainter, Camille's shouts becoming angrier, more impatient. She didn't want to leave without the diamonds, but the goons she brought weren't as invested. They didn't care if the bag was in my hands or at the bottom of the harbor. They just wanted to finish their job. Eventually, I heard the footsteps fade back toward the dockside. Camille lingered for a moment longer, her figure silhouetted against the weak gray light of dawn. I swear I could see her staring at the spot where I disappeared, waiting to see if I'd surface. She'd underestimated me once, and I'd bet my life she wouldn't make that mistake again. When I was certain they were gone, I forced myself to move. My limbs were stiff, aching from the cold, but I didn't stop. Slowly, I swam along the edge of the pier, surfacing behind a line of rotting crates and abandoned fishing gear. The dock was empty now, save for the occasional screech of seagulls and the whisper of waves lapping against wood. I climbed onto the slick planks, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. The bag was still strapped to me, soaked but intact. I unzipped it just enough to make sure. The diamonds glittered like frozen stars. The fortune I'd risked everything for. The fortune everyone else was willing to kill for. But now it wasn't enough. Camille had burned me, and my former employers had put a target on my back. I couldn't go back to Antwerp, and I couldn't trust anyone in this world of fences and smugglers. My options were drying up fast. Rotterdam sprawled out ahead of me, an industrial maze of cranes, storage yards, and abandoned warehouses. It was exactly the kind of place someone could disappear, if they were smart. I made my way inland, my soaked clothes drawing occasional stares from dock workers finishing their shifts. They didn't care about me, though. I was just another nobody in a city that swallowed people whole. I needed a plan. Kofi was out of the question, and Camille had already shown her hand. If I wanted to escape this mess alive, I needed leverage. The kind of leverage that would make even the people hunting me pause. I ducked into an old cafe near the train station, the kind of place where nobody asked questions. The owner gave me a wary glance as I slid into a booth, but a fistful of euros was enough to shut him up. I ordered coffee, black, and pulled out the burner phone. There was one last number I could try. It was a gamble, but I didn't have the luxury of playing it safe anymore. I punched in the digits and waited, staring out at the gray streets of Rotterdam as the line rang. Finally, a voice answered, male, low, and calm. Who is this? It's Lucas, I said, keeping my voice steady. I have something you want. There was a long pause. Then, the diamonds? I hesitated. Some of them, enough to make it worth your while. Another pause. Where are you? You'll get my location when I see the money, I said. Half up front, wired to an offshore account. You know the drill. The water around me felt like ice-cold needles piercing my skin. My lungs burned as I clung to the barnacle-covered piling beneath the dock, desperately trying to quiet my breaths. Above, the men continued to scan the water with their flashlights, beams slicing the gloom like razor blades. I stayed hidden, counting the seconds. The voices grew fainter, Camille's shouts becoming angrier, more impatient. She didn't want to leave without the diamonds, but the goons she brought weren't as invested. They didn't care if the bag was in my hands or at the bottom of the harbor. They just wanted to finish their job. Eventually, I heard the footsteps fade back toward the dockside. Camille lingered for a moment longer, her figure silhouetted against the weak gray light of dawn. I swear I could see her staring at the spot where I disappeared, waiting to see if I'd surface. She'd underestimated me once, and I'd bet my life she wouldn't make that mistake again. When I was certain they were gone, I forced myself to move. My limbs were stiff, aching from the cold, but I didn't stop. Slowly, I swam along the edge of the pier, surfacing behind a line of rotting crates and abandoned fishing gear. The dock was empty now, save for the occasional screech of seagulls and the whisper of waves lapping against wood. I climbed onto the slick planks, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. The bag was still strapped to me, soaked but intact. I unzipped it just enough to make sure. The diamonds glittered like frozen stars. The fortune I'd risked everything for. The fortune everyone else was willing to kill for. But now it wasn't enough. Camille had burned me, and my former employers had put a target on my back. I couldn't go back to Antwerp, and I couldn't trust anyone in this world of fences and smugglers. My options were drying up fast. Rotterdam sprawled out ahead of me, an industrial maze of cranes, storage yards, and abandoned warehouses. It was exactly the kind of place someone could disappear, if they were smart. I made my way inland, my soaked clothes drawing occasional stares from dock workers finishing their shifts. They didn't care about me, though. I was just another nobody in a city that swallowed people whole. I needed a plan. Kofi was out of the question, and Camille had already shown her hand. If I wanted to escape this mess alive, I needed leverage. The kind of leverage that would make even the people hunting me pause. I ducked into an old cafe near the train station, the kind of place where nobody asked questions. The owner gave me a wary glance as I slid into a booth, but a fistful of euros was enough to shut him up. I ordered coffee, black, and pulled out the burner phone. There was one last number I could try. It was a gamble, but I didn't have the luxury of playing it safe anymore. I punched in the digits and waited, staring out at the gray streets of Rotterdam as the line rang. Finally, a voice answered, male, low, and calm. Who is this? It's Lucas, I said, keeping my voice steady. I have something you want. There was a long pause. Then, the diamonds? I hesitated. Some of them, enough to make it worth your while. Another pause. Where are you? You'll get my location when I see the money, I said. Half up front, wired to an offshore account. You know the drill. 2 weeks later, I sat on a balcony overlooking the turquoise waters of the Caribbean, a cold drink in my hand. The money was mine now, and the diamonds were long gone, scattered, sold, and forgotten. The newspapers back in Belgium told a different story. Camille had disappeared, and my employers were under investigation for fraud. They'd tried to pin the whole mess on me, but without the diamonds or a body, there was nothing left to chase. I should have felt triumphant, but all I felt was hollow. A courier without a job, a thief without a score. Freedom came with its own price, and I'd paid it in full.